The roar of the machine gun sounded like a never-ending thunderclap. Each burst ripped chunks from trees, kicked up clouds of dust, and left behind the warm smell of gunpowder mixed with smoke. The ground trembled beneath muddy boots, and the wind carried the metallic sound of shell casings falling incessantly. There in the middle of that devastated field, a man was about to die. Not because he was weak, but because he was face to face with a machine built to kill anything that dared raise its head. A fortified machine gun nest, perched high on a ravine, protecting the entire valley as if it were the very mouth of hell. He lay face down, breathing rapidly, his arm bleeding from a piece of shrapnel that had pierced his flesh like butter. Dust clung to the sweat on his face, and his teeth gnashed with pure tension as bullets sliced through the air inches from his head. Behind him, 2 soldiers already lay motionless, victims of the same burst of gunfire that had knocked him to the ground seconds before. Their silence was worse than the noise. It was a warning that he would be next. The enemy up above seemed to be having a good time. The cadence of gunfire rose and fell, as if they were savoring the destruction, like hunters circling wounded prey. With each attempt at movement, however slight, a new barrage of projectiles streaked across the field, exploding earth like small grenades. The feeling was clear. There was no way out. There were no reinforcements. There was no cover. There was no chance. Only death advancing one step at a time. The man took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling of his hands. The air burned his throat, and his heart pounded so hard it felt like it wanted to burst from his chest. The final blow was coming, and he knew it. The enemies knew it. Even the forest knew. Everything around seemed to watch that moment, as if it were an inevitable sentence. The enemy position was considered invincible. It had already wiped out 3 entire platoons. Mortar fire hadn't brought them down. Frontal advances had turned into carnage. Not even the most experienced had found a safe angle of approach. It was a fortress sculpted by war. And now, there he was, alone, blood trickling down his forearm, and his breath failing, about to become just another abandoned body in the field. The wind brought an even stronger gust, and the earth beside his face exploded, throwing stones and dirt everywhere. It was the end. There was no other explanation. There was no other destiny. But at the exact moment when death seemed inevitable, when the world fell silent within him and everything seemed already decided, something changed. A thought came to mind, a souvenir, something that had nothing to do with war. And yet it was exactly what that hell needed. Something so improbable, so outside the realm of military logic, that no one would ever have considered it. But he considered it, and at that moment, something inside him said, softly, almost like a whisper coming from the surrounding trees, they were wrong. After everything you've heard so far, can you imagine what makes a man, on the verge of death, defy something everyone believed to be impossible? If this story has already caught your attention, subscribe to the channel to follow every detail of the upcoming twists and turns. Also, leave a like. It helps a lot. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to get to know better who is walking with me through these stories. When he said even if only to himself they were wrong, it wasn't arrogance nor the bravado of a soldier trying to convince himself. It was memory. It was instinct. It was the voice of someone who had faced death up close before, not in the trenches but in the forest. The thought that arose in that moment of pure despair had no smell of gunpowder or sound of explosion. It smelled of wet earth, of trampled leaves, of dying out campfire smoke. It was the smell of the life he led before the war. The forest ranger, for that's what they knew him before he received a uniform, never saw himself as a hero. In fact, he never saw himself as anything more than a simple man, surrounded by trees, rivers, mountains, and silence. He grew up in a small wooden house where the icy wind blew through the cracks during the winter. From childhood, he woke before sunrise to help his father carry firewood, repair fences, watch trails, and chase away poachers. He learned to distinguish sounds that anyone else would call forest noises, the crack of a branch that shouldn't have broken, the rustling of leaves indicating more weight than the wind could move, the sudden silence that betrayed the presence of a predator. There, in that war-torn field, those same senses began to awaken within him, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to. Each bullet that tore through the air seemed to bring an echo of memories. the jaguar attack he barely survived at. Age 14, the time he got lost in the woods for 3 days straight, eating leaves and drinking stream water until he found his way. The day he saved a wounded hunter by carrying him almost 5 kilometers to the nearest road. All these things shaped his body and mind, long before the army tried to make him follow rigid rules and manuals. The truth is that, behind that dirty, bloodied and heavy uniform, there still existed the same man who walked barefoot through the woods so as not to frighten. Animals who slept in hammocks tied between trees, who could distinguish the sound of a hollow log from that of a wasp's nest just by the vibration of the wind. And it was this life, silent and hard, that began to pulsate within him again. When he raised his head millimeters above the fallen trunk to observe the machine gun nest, something no one else noticed appeared before his trained eyes. A detail of the terrain, a bend in the roots, a space between bushes, a broken sound pattern in the bursts of gunfire. None of that would matter to an ordinary soldier, but to him it was like a luminous trail right in front of him. His heart was still racing, not from panic, but from understanding. The machine gun was powerful, yes. The position was almost perfect, yes. The enemies were experienced, yes. But there had been a mistake. And in the forest, a mistake is synonymous with vulnerability. He took a deep breath and let the dust settle on his face as if it were war paint. For the first time since he'd been trapped there, he didn't feel like a target. He felt awake. His mind began to mentally reconstruct the ravine where the nest was located. Every exposed root, every stone, every slope, every shadow. The bullets continued to pass close to his body, but now they no longer completely occupied his thoughts. It was as if the battlefield was returning to being a forest, and in the forest he was not the prey. He never was. But that didn't erase the fear. The fear was still there, throbbing hot, reminding him every second that one wrong step was all it would take to become just another nameless body in the landscape. Only now the fear didn't paralyze him. The fear guided him. It was the fear he had learned to tame since childhood, when he faced entire nights alone, listening to animals approaching, feeling the darkness touch his skin, knowing that any distraction could cost him his life. And as he watched the machine gun nest, he noticed something else. The rhythm of the shots wasn't constant. There was a pause, short, almost imperceptible, but real. A hesitation in the operator, perhaps heat in the weapon, perhaps a change of position, perhaps nervousness. For an ordinary soldier, this made no difference. For him, it was the perfect opening to start something that no one else would attempt. He took another deep breath, inhaling the scent of the earth rising. Each particle that rose with the explosions seemed to push him back into that wild state the army had never managed to wrest from him. And in that moment he knew that his entire life, every night in the cold, every trail opened in the dark, every silent chase, every trap dismantled, had been training for that one instant. He looked at his hands, stained with blood and dirt. They trembled, but not from weakness. They trembled because they were about to do something new, something no military manual taught, something only a forest ranger would understand. And then, with an eerie calmness amidst the chaos, he let his body sink even further into the ground, synchronized his breathing with the sound of the machine gun, and began to plan his approach, not as a soldier, but as a predator. Before being thrown into that hell of war, before donning a uniform that barely fit the broad shoulders of someone who grew up carrying logs, he was just Elias, a forest ranger, in a region so remote that many maps didn't even mark it correctly. A man who lived where silence speaks louder than any human voice. A man who learned early on that the forest doesn't forgive carelessness, but rewards those who know how to listen. Elias never had luxury, status, or recognition. His entire life was built with the few resources that the rural world offered him: worn tools, cracked boots, patched hammocks, old pots, and the same wood-burning stove his father had used decades before. The simple house, built by him and his father, creaked in the strong wind of the early mornings. And yet, it was the place where he felt most alive. His mother died young, a victim of a fever for which the village had no cure. His father, a hard and silent man, raised Elias the way he knew how, through hard work. The forest is not your friend, but it is not your enemy either. It only respects those who know how to read its rules. That was the first lesson the old man gave his son, and Elias carried that phrase like one carries a secret map. He grew up understanding that in nature, survival depends not on strength, but on understanding, something that soldiers in shining uniforms would never grasp. At 9 years old, he could already track animal tracks more accurately than many adult men. At 12, he could identify the wind direction just by the movement of the tallest leaves. At 15, he saved his father from a falling tree trunk by pulling it away seconds before impact, not by force, but because he heard a faint, almost inaudible sound of fibers breaking inside. At 17, when his father died, Elias was left alone with the forest, and there he truly came into his own. With no one to tell him what to do, he learned the hard way, living alongside wild animals, storms, and poachers who respected no one. And it was precisely by confronting these men that Elias learned something crucial, something that would decide the fate of that hostile position years later: how to approach someone who is armed without being noticed. It wasn't just tracking, it was rhythm, it was breathing, it was knowing how to use sound to your advantage. It was moving as if you were part of the forest, and not an intruder trying to survive in it. As a forest ranger, Elias had already faced situations that demanded more courage than any military manual could teach. Once he confronted heavily armed hunters who were destroying the local wildlife. He had no rifle, no backup, no orders coming by radio. He only had his perception, his knowledge, and the conviction that if he didn't do something, they would kill a jaguar with cubs. Of 3, he took down 2 without firing a weapon. The third escaped. And Elias never told this story to anyone, because he didn't think it was heroism. He thought it was simply what had to be done. But the hard life didn't just shape skills. It shaped feelings. Elias never considered himself special. He never sought glory. He knew loneliness better than many soldiers knew their own names. He knew profound fear, not the fear of dying, but the fear of failing those who depend on you. He knew the weight of silent responsibility, the kind no one sees, but which follows you like a shadow. And perhaps that's why, on the battlefield, while many soldiers froze in terror at the first burst of gunfire, Elias didn't succumb. Not because I didn't feel fear. He did, very much so, but he knew how to use it as a compass. He knew that each burst of machine gun fire in front of him was like the roar of a wounded animal. It revealed position, rhythm, intention. The others only heard noise. He heard pattern. On that particular day, standing before that machine gun nest that had already claimed dozens of lives, Elias felt something he hadn't felt since his days in the jungle, the same chill down his spine that he felt when a jaguar watched him, hidden before attacking. But along with that coldness came clarity, the same clarity that always came in critical moments, as if something inside him entered another state, where the world slowed down and the details came to life. He was no ordinary soldier. He wasn't a man trained in military academies. He had no diplomas, tactics, blueprints, or manuals. He had something no sergeant understood and no general could replicate: a wild instinct, shaped by the hardest life there is, a life far from everything where you only have yourself. And it was this instinct, this profound reading of the terrain, this ancestral sensitivity that ignited within him an unshakable certainty. That machine gun nest wasn't invincible, not to someone who understood the language of the land. War had changed many men, but Elijah brought the transformation that existed before the war. He brought nature with him, and in that moment when everyone else had given up, he was the only one able to see a hidden path, a path so improbable that it could only have been discovered by someone who had lived longer in the forest than among people. And the world was about to find out. The plan that began to take shape in Elias's mind at that moment didn't come from military training, nor from officers' instructions, nor from tactics books. It came from a much older, much more intimate and much wilder place, the muscle memory of a lifetime, dealing with dangers that didn't forgive mistakes. It was as if, at the exact moment he saw the pattern of the shots and the natural contours of the terrain, everything had aligned into a single thought. I've been through something similar. To any other soldier, that would have seemed like madness. But to Elias it made perfect sense. He recalled a case from years before, when he had to capture a hunter who was setting illegal traps near a cliff. The man was violent, fast, and always had the upper hand. Elias couldn't get close without being seen. Every time he tried a flank, the hunter would change position and hide behind natural cover. It was like chasing an armed shadow. But Elias realized something at the time that would change everything. The sound deceived the victim. The cliff face's stone walls created an echo, and those unfamiliar with the area followed the sound, not its true origin. That's how Elias approached unnoticed. Using the echo itself to simulate his last position, he threw a stone far away, letting the sound travel down the cliff face. The hunter, thinking he was heading in that direction, turned the wrong way. Elias approached from the opposite side, and he ended up winning. The memory came like a bolt of lightning. The machine gun nest, like the hunter's shelter, had a natural weakness. He relied entirely on sound to identify the enemy's advance, because the field was full of smoke, dust, and uneven vegetation. Operators were firing more by listening than by seeing. That's why they were able to stop any advance. Everything echoed, reverberated, hit the hard ground of the embankment, and came back amplified. For an ordinary soldier, this was despair. For Elias, this was an opportunity. And that's when the trick appeared. So simple that any commander would have called it stupid. A trick so basic, it could only have come from someone who spent their life blending into the forest, to divert the sound from one's own presence. His plan was insane, pure suicide in the mind of any normal man. But Elias wasn't normal, and at that moment he wasn't thinking like a soldier. He was thinking like someone who had learned to survive against predators, traps, and hunters. Elias picked up a broken piece of wood that was beside the body and, with his hand still bloody, began to test its weight. It wasn't big, it wasn't strong, it wasn't particularly useful, but it served its purpose. First, he took a deep breath, trying to synchronize his chest with the rhythm of the gusts. He couldn't run into the wrong noise, he couldn't stand up at the wrong moment. It was like hunting, but also like being hunted. This demanded absolute precision. When the machine gun made a slight pause, that same brief glitch that only trained eyes would notice, Elias threw the piece of wood as far as possible so that it would fall in the area where the enemy expected the advance. The branch made a noise, a dry noise, artificial, enough. The enemy reacted immediately, unleashing a violent burst of gunfire in that direction, believing the sound came from a soldier attempting to advance. Dust rose, vegetation burst open, and their attention was drawn to the wrong spot. In that same second, Elias moved, but not forward. He moved sideways. He crawled, quickly, like someone gliding between roots, letting his body stick to the ground like an animal that knows the slightest curve in its spine could cost it its life. He moved almost a meter before the machine gun returned to its standard scan. That worked. Elias felt his own heart pounding like a muffled drum in his chest. The fear was still there, but now it was tamed, guiding, not hindering. He repeated the movement. Another branch, another throw, another reaction from the enemy. Elias advanced, along the invisible flank, the area no one dared enter because it seemed too exposed, but not for him. For Elias, that part of the terrain was a natural corridor of silence, a stretch where the wind made more noise than footsteps, a perfect place for someone who knew how to move in harmony with the environment. Each meter he advanced seemed to intensify the world around him. The sound grew sharper, the gunshots closer, the smell of burning metal stronger. Elias's breath caught in his throat at the slightest carelessness. He crawled over sharp stones, cutting his forearms and knees. The pain was real, but it was small compared to the risk. And the trick kept working. False noise, reaction from the nest, real movement in another direction. It was a deadly dance, a game of attention, a simple and brilliant manipulation. The enemy, realizing that something was approaching but unable to see anything, began to panic. The machine gun accelerated, then stopped, then changed angle. Each mistake increased the panic. They were wasting ammunition against shadows. Elias, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly calm, increasingly aligned with who he had always been. The war had tried to mold him, but the forest had molded him first, and better. The trick that would change the fate of that battle wasn't explosive, technological, or military. It was the primitive ability of deceive the enemy's ears, something that no tactics book would teach. But a man alone, raised among trees and predators, knew how to do it like no one else. He was getting closer and closer to the nest, close enough to feel the vibration of the machine gun barrel from the impacts on the ground, and that was just the beginning. From the moment Elias realized the trick worked, something changed within him. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't blind confidence, it was a silent transformation. The same simple man who grew up clearing trails and tracking footprints was now moving as if the battlefield were his old forest. Each burst of gunfire that echoed through the valley ceased to be a threat and became information. Each pause, each change of cadence, each adjustment of the sniper revealed fear. Not the fear of losing a position, but the ancestral primal fear of not knowing. Where the enemy is here, Elias became exactly that, an invisible figure. The psychological terror began subtly. First, one of the machine gun operators turned to his comrade, shouting something in their language, clearly nervous. The weapons framing forced them to aim at a narrow strip of terrain, nothing beyond that. And for them it was as if shadows were passing by on all sides at once. They were being hunted, and they didn't know by whom. The machine gun began firing in increasingly desperate, uncoordinated patterns. With each new false sound Elias made with stones, pieces of wood, or small taps on the fallen log, a barrage of shots was released in the wrong direction. They were wasting ammunition like someone trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Meanwhile, Elijah continued advancing. He crawled with the same fluidity as a crawling animal, using his elbows and knees as silent pivots. He breathed with the rhythm of the earth. His body was already covered in scratches and dried blood, but the pain seemed distant, as if it were happening to another man, in another world. What occupied his mind was not courage, nor heroism. It was absolute focus. It was the ancestral certainty that the predator wins when it sees more than the victim. Elias was getting closer and closer to the nest, but now he could hear more than just gunshots. He heard voices, muffled screams, despair growing. The enemy couldn't understand how something could get so close without leaving footprints, without making a sound, without offering a target. For them, this wasn't war. It was a haunting. The terrain, once safe and controlled, was transformed into a hostile labyrinth. And this inversion was so brutal that even the machine gun, a symbol of power and control, became a symbol of impotence. The psychological terror reached its peak when the gun started firing repeatedly, not due to overheating, but because the operators hesitated. They were missing all the time. They were shooting into empty space. They were being deceived by someone who seemed to have eyes and ears everywhere. Elias realized this quickly, and he deepened the terror. He began tapping lightly on different tree trunks at random intervals. A sound here, another there. Small crackling sounds that the vegetation amplified. To the operators, it looked like an advance by multiple soldiers. It looked like a coordinated command. It looked like a large number. But it was Elijah. Just one man. Just one. In this almost supernatural rise, Elias ceased to be the forest ranger and became something his enemies would fear in the years to come, the ghost of the ravine. At the same time, something deeper was happening inside Elias. The battlefield, so hostile, to everyone else seemed to align itself with him. The vegetation provided shade when needed. The wind carried sounds in the right direction. The tall leaves swayed in perfect rhythm to conceal micro-movements. It wasn't magic, but it felt like it. It was the sum of perception, instinct, and a lifetime lived as part of nature. His senses were so heightened that he could feel the vibration of the machine gun barrel in the air, like a second pulse. He could hear the shift in emotion in the sea, operators' screams. He could sense the exact moment when fear gripped them, and it was precisely when panic set in that the enemy began to lose the war even before Elias attacked the nest. The machine gun was failing morally. The operators shouted at each other. One of them stood up for a second to try to get a better look, and that second was all Elias needed to advance another 2 meters. Now he was too close. Close enough to see the glint of metal through the foliage. Close enough to feel the heat of the gusts cutting through the air in front of him. The psychological terror turned to utter despair when one of the operators simply stopped firing. The other tried to compensate, but the shots were no longer accurate. They no longer knew where to aim. They didn't know where the danger was coming from. They were surrounded by an enemy that didn't exist in their eyes. Elias rose for an instant, but as quickly as a shadow in the dark, his silhouette appeared and vanished before the machine gun could travel the necessary arc to reach him. It was enough to confirm to the operators that someone was there, but not just anyone. Someone who appeared and disappeared as if they were part of the forest. He heard one of them shout something like, "He's here!" But the phrase was lost in the noise of the gun and the wind. Elias was already too close to turn back. His rise was so impressive that if someone had seen it from afar, they wouldn't have believed that a single man was emotionally crumbling an entire fortified nest. But it was real. It was brutal. He was living proof that when a man understands the terrain better than any army, he becomes a force of nature. And the nest was about to find that out the hard way. The moment Elias got too close to the nest did not go unnoticed. The brief shadow he cast was enough to transform the operator's panic into utter despair. And despair is dangerous, not only for those who feel it, but for those around them. The men in the nest began, shouting uncoordinated orders, demanding immediate support. The radio crackled, frantic communication swept across the valley, and within minutes, the enemy had mobilized more than twice the forces they had used to defend that position until then. They were going after him, not because they thought he was an ordinary soldier, but because they were convinced they were facing a threat capable of devastating that entire fortress single-handedly. Fear does that. It transforms a single man into an army. And then the second part of hell began. The first reinforcements to arrive were a group of 3 enemy soldiers, equipped with grenades and sniper rifles. They quickly positioned themselves atop the embankment, attempting to surround the area where they suspected Elias was hiding. The terrain, once merely hostile, now transformed into a deadly arena. The trees, which had previously served as camouflage, became obstacles that could trap him. Every trunk, every root, every shadow was a risk. But Elias was already accustomed to risks. He just wasn't used to so many armed men searching for him at once. He heard the footsteps before he saw them. Heavy, nervous footsteps, forcefully breaking branches, a clear sign that they were not advancing calmly. They were advancing with fear. This type of footstep reveals not only the enemy's direction, but also their intention. And their intention was clear, to crush the ghost that was destroying the troops' morale. Elias hid behind a fallen log, but soon realized that this would only buy him a few seconds. The soldiers were approaching quickly, and this time they weren't firing blindly. They were sniffing, hunting. One of them threw a grenade to the opposite side, as a precaution. The explosion shook the ground like thunder, raising dust that burned Elias's nose. The impact instinctively rolled him to the side, and it was in this roll that he felt the tear. A bullet passed so close it tore skin and flesh from his left shoulder. A hot, sharp pain made his arm tremble involuntarily. He brought his hand to the wound, felt the blood trickle quickly between his fingers. He was truly wounded, and this time it wasn't just a scratch from a pebble, it was a gunshot. And gunshots don't forgive. His body began to react as it always had in the worst moments of his life, entering a state of pure survival. His heart raced, but his mind cleared. He knew that if he stood there, he would be killed in seconds. So, with his shoulder throbbing and his breath short, Elias crawled behind a group of rocks and held his wounded arm against his chest, trying to stop the bleeding. The enemies were approaching. One of them descended the embankment with tactical precision, scanning the ground with the tip of his rifle like an experienced hunter. Elias watched him through the gaps between the rocks. The man was tense, sweating, looking all around. But even nervous, he had method, he had focus, he had discipline. He wasn't an amateur. He wasn't an armed rural peasant. He was a soldier trained to fight soldiers, not ghosts. And that's when Elias realized his trick had a limited lifespan. The more time the enemy gave him, the more adapted they became. The psychological terror he had created was beginning to be replaced by brute determination. They wanted to prove that the ghost bled. They wanted to show that he was just a man, and to do that, they needed to kill Elias with their own hands. The enemy hunter took 2 more steps and got too close. Elias had no choice. In a swift movement, he pressed his wounded arm against his chest, braced his body on his right leg, and attacked like a cornered animal. He leaped upon the soldier, knocking him forcefully to the ground. The rifle fell to the side, but the enemy still tried to reach for the pistol in his belt. Elias grabbed him by the wrist and with his other hand pushed his face against the dirt floor, fighting against his own fatigue and the pain in his shoulder. The fight was silent, brutal, and quick. The second soldier, hearing the commotion, began to run toward them. Elias didn't have time to think. He used the fallen enemy's own rifle as an improvised shield, raising it just as the second soldier fired. The bullet hit the butt of the rifle, deflected and ricocheted away. That was enough to make Elias throw himself backward, rolling around, searching for any shade that could provide cover. But the price of this effort nearly broke his strength. His body was trembling. Blood trickled down in thick rivulets. Fatigue began to creep in like a heavy wave. The sound of his breathing turned into a wheeze, and yet he was still alive. The enemy realized this, and he became even more furious. The reinforcements called in more soldiers. Within minutes, the number of men searching for Elias had tripled. Now there were more than 10, some armed with submachine guns, others with grenades, others with long-range rifles. They were scouring the terrain as if searching for a legendary beast, and in a way that was exactly what they were. It was at that moment that Elijah understood something terrible. Greatness comes at a price, and the price was being paid at that very second. Each advance he made had awakened the enemy's fear. Now every retreat by the enemy was provoking their fury. They wanted Elijah dead, and they were willing to do anything. A gust of wind struck the rock behind him, sending fragments flying across his face. He reflexively closed his eyes. When he opened them, he saw blood trickling from his forehead. Not a deep wound, but enough to impair his vision. He blinked to ward off the burning sensation, but the pain throbbed sharply in his shoulder, radiating through his chest and arm. The forest was with him, but his body was already beginning to fail. And yet, even wounded, bleeding, surrounded, and with minimal chances, Elias knew he couldn't stop, because there was something bigger than him in that battle. And the nest still had to fall. The ravine seemed to pulsate. Every sound, every missed burst of gunfire, every muffled cry, every gasp of breath was like a warning that the end was near. Elias, covered in his own blood and dirt, felt the weight of his entire life on his shoulders. Not the physical weight, that he no longer felt numbed by adrenaline, but the moral weight, the unwavering awareness that if he failed now, dozens of men behind him would die. If he retreated, the nest would continue to dominate the valley. If he gave up, their deaths would be his fault. And that was something Elijah would never accept carrying. With his shoulder burning like a live ember, his vision partially blurred by the blood on his forehead, and his breathing deep and irregular, he surveyed the terrain one last time, not as a soldier, but as a forest ranger, as a man who had learned from a young age that every tree, every stone, every curve of earth tells a story. And at that moment, they were all telling the same one. There was only one possible route, a suicidal route, a narrow path between two rocks, where the ground was soft and the vegetation taller, a natural corridor that, if used with absolute perfection, would allow Elias to climb to the flank of the nest without being seen. That was it. There was no alternative plan. There was no plan B. There were no reinforcements, no miracle. Either he would get there, or he would die trying. Elias swallowed hard. He felt a scratch in his throat. He closed his eyes, breathed in the heavy, hot air of the gunpowder, and let his mind wander home. Not the old wooden house, but the other home, the forest. He imagined the smell of damp leaves, the sounds of distant animals, the wind singing through the trees as it always did, and when he opened his eyes, the ordinary man had vanished. What remained was his essence, the silent predator, the guardian of the forest, the force that nature shaped. And so he began the climb. The enemy. Soldiers were still sweeping the terrain, throwing grenades, crawling, shouting disjointed orders. But Elias was no ordinary target. He made no noise. He left no trace. He didn't breathe heavily. He moved with the rhythm of the earth, letting his body blend into the shadows. Every inch gained was a silent battle, a deadly choreography between his body and the watchful gaze of his enemies. When a soldier came too close, Elias lay completely flat on the ground, letting his chest touch the cold earth. He remained so still that even the ants climbed onto his forearm without realizing there was a man there. His breathing ceased for almost 15 seconds, a gesture that no trained soldier could replicate. Only someone who had spent their entire life observing animals in the forest would know how to do it. When the path was clear, he moved forward. 1 meter, then 2 more, then 4 more. The pain in his shoulder felt like it was cutting through muscles like blades. But Elias didn't give up. When he finally reached the highest point, close enough to hear the exchange of ammunition inside the nest, something inside him broke. Not from despair, but from decision. He knew exactly what he needed to do, and it wasn't pretty. It wasn't clean. It wasn't heroic in a romantic sense. It was brutal. It was visceral. It was real. He pulled a grenade from his belt, the last one he had, which he didn't even remember he was still carrying, and pulled the pin with a steady hand, despite the blood running down his fingers. He didn't throw it immediately. He waited. He watched. He sensed the right moment. And when the machine gun operator shouted something like, "Back off! Back off!" indicating that they were repositioning themselves, Elias threw the explosive into the side opening of the shelter. Time seemed to stand still. The sound seemed to bite through the air. The explosion was violent. The earth trembled. The air filled with dust and fragments. The machine gun, a symbol of terror, for days fell silent instantly. The entire nest opened like rotten tree bark. Silence. A heavy, dense, almost sacred silence. And there, atop that ravine filled with the smell of gunpowder, Elias fell to his knees. Not out of weakness, but out of the certainty that it was over. The objective, which seemed impossible, had been accomplished. The valley fell silent for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. Then, shouts began to emerge behind him from the Allied troops. Shouts of relief, of victory, of disbelief. Many didn't even understand how it had happened. Some thought it was an air raid. Others thought elite units had arrived. No one imagined that it had been just one man, a forest ranger, without high rank, no military honor, no medals on their chests, no recorded history, but with something that no one else had, the skill that only wildlife teaches. When the Allied soldiers finally reached the summit, they found Elias sitting there, breathing heavily, staring at the horizon as if he was seeing something else, perhaps remembering home, perhaps just trying to understand that he was still alive. One of them placed a hand on his shoulder, but Elias barely reacted. His body was at its limit. His mind, too. He only did what he had come to do. I didn't want glory. I didn't want recognition. I didn't want to be a hero. And when they asked him his name, he simply said, Elias, Forest Ranger. Nothing more. Days later, officers tried to turn him into a symbol. They wanted to take him to ceremonies. They wanted to promote him. They wanted to put him in special battalions. He refused them all. He only asked to return to work in the bush when the war was over. And he returned. No medals, no speeches, no honors. He walked through the forest as before, clearing traps, rescuing wounded animals, rebuilding trails, living in complete anonymity. But far away, soldiers told his story. They spoke of the ghost of the ravine, of the man who single-handedly destroyed the nest that no battalion had managed to bring down, a man who became a legend not because he sought to be a hero, but simply because he was who he always was. And so the legacy was born, not the legacy written in history books, but the legacy that lives on in the stories told around campfires, in the whispers of veterans, in the awestruck gazes of those who heard the tale. The day a forest ranger destroyed a machine gun nest, the day nature, through a man, won the war. After witnessing all of this, what do you feel you learned from this forest ranger's story? What part moved you the most? His fear, his courage, his simplicity, or the way a single man turned the tables when no one believed in him? If this story touched you in any way, share your opinion in the comments below. I'd love to know what this journey sparked in you. And of course, if you want to keep hearing powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It's quick, helps a lot, and ensures you don't miss the next videos. Thank you.